Yo, what up? It's Darius, and welcome back to the SQL Server Series. In our last video, we talked about how to use some of the most commonly utilized aggregate functions in SQL Server. Now that you understand how aggregate functions work, you're ready to learn how to group data and use those aggregate functions to summarize the data in each group. But in order to do that, you're going to have to learn two more clauses of the select statement: the group by and having clauses. So, the purpose of the group by clause is to group rows of a result set based on one or more columns or expressions. The group by clause is mainly used in select statements that include aggregate functions. In fact, many of the select statements you write that have aggregate functions, you will most likely be using the group by clause with them. And this is because if you include aggregate functions in your select statement, the aggregate is calculated for each set of values that results from the columns named in the group by clause. Now, the having clause is used to specify the search condition for a group or an aggregate function, and this condition is applied after the rows that satisfy the search condition in the where clause are grouped. I mean, this is if you have a where clause included in your select statement. But if you don't, you can still use the having clause to specify a search condition. So now that the boring lecture is over, let's get into some programming. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a query that calculates the average invoice amount by vendor, and it's going to come from our invoices table, and it's going to use the group by clause and the having clause. So I'm going to select all from invoices, and then after that I want to remove my asterisk sign here, and I'm just going to get the vendor ID from this table, and then I want to get the average invoice total, and I'm going to display that as the average invoice amount is what I want to name it, so I don't get confused. And then while I'm getting my vendor ID and the average invoice total, I'm just going to go ahead and group these by their vendor ID. And I'm going to say having. I want to group the average invoice total by vendor ID, having my average invoice total greater than 2000. So like we explained, the group by clause is going to group the rows of the result set based on one or more columns or expressions, which is what we have here, our vendor ID. And then our having clause is going to be the search condition. And in our having clause here, we're going to it's basically another way of saying, where the average of the invoice total is greater than 2000. But instead we're using the having clause, and this is because the where clause cannot include aggregate functions. So we have to use the having clause. And then to finalize this query, I'm just going to order by the average invoice amount. And now you see here, now we have the average invoice amount here. That is where the average invoice total is greater than 2000. And you see our smallest one here is 2184, so it definitely meets that condition. And it is grouped by vendor ID. And so what this is doing is only calculating the average invoice total for the vendors that exist in the invoices table, since we grouped it by vendor ID. Now if you notice, I was able to order by my average invoice amount, which is the alias name of the average invoice total. And so that's something that you can do, when you're using the group by and having clause, is using that alias name to order by in your query here. Now another thing that's important that we need to make sure we pay attention to here is, let's say I were to remove my group by clause. Let's say I cut it out from the query and then I run my select statement. We see this error message down here at the bottom that comes up saying column invoices.vendor ID is invalid in the select list because it is not contained in either an aggregate function or the group by clause. And that is because here in our column list, we included the vendor ID column, and then we included an aggregate function here. And the only way that can work, that combination can work, is if there is the group by clause. If you were to get rid of the vendor ID, it would work without the group by clause. But because the vendor ID is here and it is not an aggregate function, then it has to have a group by clause with it. So if we include it back and run it, then it'll work. And as you can see, we are grouping by that same exact column that does not contain an aggregate function. And that is how the group by clause works with aggregate functions. Now, one last thing I want to talk about in this video is how to use the group by clause with the roll-up operator. Now, the roll-up operator, what that does is it gives you a final summary row in your result set at the very last row, and you can include it at the end of your group by clause. So it would be group by vendor ID, with rollup. But I'm going to write a new query so I can show you how to properly use it. And this is going to be a summary query that includes, a final summary row using the with rollup operator. So the first thing I want to do is I want to select my vendor ID. This is coming from the invoices table, and then I'm going to get the count of all my records, and I'm going to name that my invoice count, and then I'm going to get the sum of my invoice total, and I'm going to name that my invoice total. And then, like I said, this is going to come from the invoices table, and then I'm going to group by vendor ID with rollup so I can get my final summary row. And then I'm going to run this query, and I'm going to come to the very bottom, and you see my very last row here that has a vendor ID of null is my summary row. This with my with rollup operator. It gives me a count of all my invoice counts here which total to 114, and then it summarizes all my invoice totals here down at the bottom to 214,290.51. So this is my summary, my final summary row here using the with rollup operator. Now if I were to remove with rollup and then run this query, come way down to the bottom, you see line item number 35 is no longer there. My summary row is gone, and it just continues finishing off its query. So that is how you use the with rollup operator to get a final summary row in your result set. So that is all for this video. In the next video, we are going to look at how to code subqueries. It's going to be an interesting topic that we are going to begin covering. So if you're interested in the next video, head on over to database-tutorials.com. And if you like this video, please hit the like button on it. If you disliked it, then feel free to dislike it. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And see you next time.